Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're actually doing something a little bit different than our usual fare.
Yeah, quite a bit different, actually.
Right. Usually we look at modern tech or, current events, maybe the latest bestseller that everyone is talking about. But today we're doing a sort of, well, it's a forensic analysis of a collapse.
And not a stock market class.
Exactly, not finance. A civilization collapse.
It really is a bit of an autopsy, isn't it?
It is. It really is. We are looking at this stack of notes and a transcript from a lecture that was delivered way back on December 29th, 1968.
Over 50 years ago.
Yeah, over half a century. The speaker is the Quranic scholar Allama G.A. Parwez. And while the audio is, it's old, the diagnosis he gives for why societies stagnate, why they stop moving forward and just start rotting, it feels like it literally could have been written this morning.
It's startlingly relevant to where we are right now. He's looking at a very specific section of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 108 to 118. But he's not just doing theology in the abstract sense.
Right. He's not just preaching.
No, not at all. He's actually doing sociology. He's asking this massive question. Why do nations that start with this explosive revolutionary energy eventually just grind to a total halt? Why do they become fossilized?
And the mission for our deep dive today, for you listening at home, is to really unpack his answer to that, which honestly boils down to a single fatal confusion.
The confusion between deen and mazhab.
Yes, deen and mazhab.
And for listeners who might hear those words and think, wait, aren't those just synonyms?
Because they're used that way a lot, right?
All the time. In casual conversation, sure, people just swap them out. They think they both just mean religion. But in the source material we're analyzing today, they are polar opposites. They are literally matter and antimatter.
So let's set the stage here. Because if we get this distinction wrong, Parwez argues, we get absolutely everything wrong. How does the source specifically define deen?
So deen is described in the text as a dynamic social system. Think of it less like a set of rituals and more as a way of life or even a constitution for a society. Okay, a constitution.
Right. And it's built on two main pillars. First, permanent values, and second, intellect, what the text calls aql.
Aql, meaning reason or human intellect.
Exactly. It's a system where the core values, things like truth, justice, protecting the vulnerable, rendering dues to the rightful owner, those are completely unchangeable. But the application of those values, how you actually carry them out, is totally open to human evolution. It adapts to technology and progress.
So deen is like a compass.
A compass, yeah.
It points north, and north never changes. But the compass doesn't tell you whether you should, walk or drive a car or fly a jet to get there.
That is a perfect analogy. You have the absolute freedom to choose the vehicle as long as you're heading in the right direction.
All right.
Now, compare that to mazhab. Parwez defines mazhab as what we typically call religion in that very strict ritualistic sense. It's static. It relies heavily on blind emotion, not reason. And most importantly, mazhab treats the vehicle itself as sacred.
So if your ancestors walked to the destination, mazhab says you must walk forever. Forever. If you buy a car, you're a sinner. You've deviated.
Wow. That's the self-imposed prison he talks about in the notes.
Exactly. And the stakes here, they are just massive. The source argues that when a society confuses deen with mazhab, you get what he calls spiritual blindness. You get a society that becomes economically backward because it outright refuses to adapt.
Because adapting is seen as a sin.
Right. And eventually, and this is the really scary part for any community, you get a generation that abandons faith entirely because they look at it and say, this is impracticable. I just can't live like this in the modern world.
They opt out. They choose the real world over the faith because the faith has basically made itself an enemy of reality.
Precisely. They choose survival over stagnation. It's basic human nature.
Okay, so that's our setup. To explain how the stagnation happens, how a people end up building this prison for themselves, the lecture takes us to a story. And I think many people have probably heard this story, but maybe haven't analyzed it quite like this.
The story of the Israelites.
The Bani Israel, yeah, and the cow. Hence the name of the chapter, Al-Baqarah, which means the cow.
Right, the cow incident.
Now I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. When I first read this section of the source material, I hesitated. I really did.
Why is that?
Well, the story is all about the Israelites asking too many questions about a command to sacrifice a cow. But, this is the deep dive. We love questions. We actively tell you, the listener, to be curious, to ask why. Why is the source framing asking questions as this road to ruin?
It's a really crucial distinction, and honestly, one the source makes very, very carefully. The text isn't against constructive inquiry,
Instructive mean?
meaning asking why to understand the core principle so you can apply it better.
Yeah.
The source is entirely for that. What it attacks is restrictive inquiry, trivial questioning that serves absolutely no purpose other than to narrow your own options.
Okay, walk us through the narrative arc of this story then. How exactly did they narrow their options?
So, the scenario is this. A murder has happened in the community. There are no witnesses, nobody knows who did it, and the community is on the verge of this massive, violent internal conflict. They're turning on each other.
Tensions are high.
Extremely high. To settle it, the command comes down from God. Sacrifice a cow.
Stop there. Just sacrifice a cow.
Just a cow. Baqarah. It's an indefinite article in the original language.
Yeah.
Any cow. The source emphasizes this heavily. The boundary line here was simply to perform this one act of sacrifice to resolve the dispute.
So if they had just walked out of their houses,
Grabbed the very first cow they saw and sacrificed it, the command would have been completely fulfilled. Done. Easy. Problem solved.
but obviously they didn't do that.
No, they didn't. They paused. They started overthinking it. They went back to Moses and asked, well, what age should this cow be?
Okay. I mean, is that a fair question? Maybe they wanted to get it exactly right.
But is it fair? The command was just a cow. By asking about age, they were explicitly asking for a restriction that wasn't there initially. So they get an answer. The answer comes back. Neither too young nor too old. Boom. They just lost 50% of the available cows.
The pool just shrank. They narrowed the market.
Exactly. But they don't stop there. They come back again and ask, what color is it? Now think about the psychology of that. Why are they asking about the color?
It sounds like they're stalling. Or I don't know, maybe they think there's a secret cow, like a magic cow that will work better than a regular one.
Right. It's this toxic mix of stalling and pure superstition. So, holy cow. So they get another answer, a bright, pleasing yellow. Now, how many bright yellow cows have you seen lately?
Yeah, not many. 0, actually.
Exactly. Now, the task has gone from incredibly easy to incredibly difficult, but they still keep going. They ask, what does it look like? What does it do? The final answer they get is insanely specific. A cow that has never tilled the soil, never watered the fields, spotless, perfect.
So now they are literally looking for a needle in a haystack.
And they eventually found one, yes. But the text explicitly says they had to pay an absolute fortune for it. And they did it, quote, with great difficulty. And here is the kicker. The text says they almost didn't do it at all.
Because they made it impossible for themselves.
Parwez's analysis here is just brilliant. He says, look at the mechanism of what just happened. God gave a broad, open, easy command. Humans, through their absolute obsession with detail and ritual, turned that broad avenue into a tightrope. And the source connects this directly to the concept of kufr.
Whoa, hold on. Kufr. That usually translates to disbelief or atheism in standard religious contexts. That feels incredibly heavy for just asking a few annoying questions about a cow.
It does feel heavy, but Parwez often goes back to the absolute root etymology of these words. Kufr, at its root, implies denial or covering up reality. It is the direct opposite of iman, and iman means peace and security.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The argument is this. When you have a simple, broad law, you have security. You have room to breathe and live. When you constantly ask for excessive rulings on things that God intentionally left open, you are denying that freedom. You are trading your own security for anxiety.
You trade the open field for a maze?
And the lecture argues that Muslims today are doing exactly what the Bani Israel did. We are repeating the cow incident every single day.
Give me a modern example of that. What does sacrificing the cow look like in our current context?
It looks like what we call fatwa shopping. It looks like this bizarre obsession with the absolute minutia of ritual. The source mentions people asking for divine rulings on the exact, precise distance between your feet when you stand in prayer.
Right. Or exactly how many inches high the hands should be raised.
Or whether using a modern plastic toothbrush is sunnah versus using a traditional wooden miswak stick.
Yeah, I've seen those debates. People asking, is my prayer even valid if my ankle bone wasn't physically touching the ankle bone of the guy next to me?
Exactly. And Parwez argues, God left those details open. Use your common sense. Use what's comfortable for you. But by demanding a strict religious ruling on it, you literally force the scholars to invent a restriction.
And once that restriction is written down,
It becomes holy law. You've just locked yourself in a prison cell, thrown away the key, and then you have the nerve to complain that the religion is too difficult to practice.
There's a fantastic analogy in the text about sports. I think it was football or soccer, depending on where you're listening from.
Yes, the football pitch analogy. It is honestly the best way to visualize this concept of hudud, which means limits, versus human freedom.
So God provides the pitch.
He provides the field, the earth, the universe, society. And he draws the boundary lines. These are the hudud. In football, the rule is simple. Don't step out of bounds, and don't touch the ball with your hands unless you're the goalie.
Simple, hard limits. You know exactly where you stand.
But inside those lines, the game is entirely yours. The players have to decide in real time. Do I pass left? Do I pass right? Do I dribble? Do I fall back and play defense? That is human discretion. That is strategy and intellect.
And the cow mentality we just talked about, that's like stopping the game every 10 seconds.
Exactly. It's yelling, referee, stopped. Should I pass to the left or the right? Please give me a divine ruling on my next pass. If you did that, you'd completely destroy the game. The referee would just look at you and say, play on, that's up to you.
But the source says we have created this version of religion where every single pass, every step, practically every breath requires a referee's whistle.
And the inevitable result of that is paralysis. You just can't move. A society that needs a fatwa to tie its shoelaces cannot possibly compete with a society that is using its intellect to fly to the moon.
It's amazing how he takes this ancient story about a cow and makes it entirely about modern administrative efficiency and societal progress. And I think this bridges us perfectly to the real intellectual core of this lecture, the architecture of law. We've talked about the trap, which is too many trivial questions. Now let's talk about the structure of how a society should actually work. The distinction the source makes between permanent values and flexible bylaws.
This is the very mechanics of deen versus mazhab. The source argues we absolutely must distinguish the immutable, the things that cannot and should not ever change, from the mutable, the things that absolutely must change.
The why versus the how.
Correct. The permanent values, the hudud and akar, those are the whys. Honesty, justice, protecting the weak. And the source gives a really clear example. Do not steal from another person's field.
Okay, that's a core value.
It was a true moral value 5,000 years ago in ancient Babylon. It is true today in New York City. And it will be true 5,000 years from now on a colony on Mars. Human nature's core moral needs do not shift. If you normalize stealing, the society collapses. That's a constant.
But then you have the bylaws, what the text calls the juziyat.
The how, the actual implementation of the value. And the source is almost militant about this point. The how must change. If it doesn't, the entire system rots from the inside out. The example Parwez uses is harvesting, and it is so incredibly practical.
The sickle versus the combine harvester. I love this comparison so much because it perfectly illustrates the clash between religious tradition and physical technology.
Right. So imagine a prophetic time, say 7th century Arabia. The core instruction is do not steal the harvest, but it also implies a context of how you actually go about harvesting. Back then, the absolute peak technology was a hand sickle, so maybe a custom or a local rule develops. Harvest with your sickle in the early morning before it gets too hot.
It was just the best tech available at the time. It was practical, sensible advice. It wasn't some magic spell. It was just how you effectively got the wheat out of the ground.
Exactly. But now fast forward to the 20th century, or the 21st. We have mechanical harvesters, massive combines that can clear 10,000 acres in the exact same time it took a 7th century village a whole month to clear. Now here's where the massive conflict happens. If you view the sickle itself as the religion,
If you think the physical tool is holy,
then you look at the combine harvester and you scream, Beta, innovation, heresy. This is a deviation from the pure path of our pious ancestors. We must only use sickles.
and if you do that, you starve.
You commit complete economic suicide. Your cost of producing wheat stays astronomically high, while the rest of the secular world drops its cost to pennies. You become completely impoverished. And poverty, Parwez warns, always leads to a degradation of the human self. But it actually gets worse than just being poor. It creates what he calls a guilt consciousness.
This part really struck me when I was reading the notes. The psychological toll of this mindset.
Imagine you are a farmer in this society. You know, logically, you need the mechanical harvester to feed your family. You know the hand sickle isn't working anymore, so you buy the machine, you use it. But every single time you turn the ignition key, deep down in your soul, you feel like a bad believer. You feel like you're betraying your faith just to survive in the real world.
You're living in a constant state of cognitive dissonance.
It literally splits your personality in half. You become a hypocrite purely by necessity. And the source argues that this exact dynamic is the actual root of secularism in the Muslim world. People didn't become secular because they woke up one day and hated God. They became secular because the God they were presented with, the God of the sickle, was completely incompatible with actual human life.
So they put God in a little box, they leave him in the mosque on Friday, and they live in the real mechanical world for the rest of the week.
Because they have to.
And Parwez says this paralysis, it isn't just about farming. It extends to the courts, to the justice system.
Oh, absolutely. It infects everything. He mentions the legal system specifically. Right. He talks about judges in the modern era trying to apply the Allama G.A, which, for context, is this massive, multi-volume 17th century legal code commissioned by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. They try to apply that to modern 20th century problems.
It's like trying to regulate the internet using the Code of Hammurabi. It just doesn't map onto the reality.
Specifically, he brings up divorce laws, the concept of khula, which is a woman's right to initiate an exit from a marriage. The source argues that the original Quranic text makes this relatively simple. If the couple cannot maintain the limits of God, meaning basic happiness, peace, mutual respect, they part ways amicably. It's essentially a contract.
Yeah.
If the terms of the contract are broken, you dissolve it.
Right, it's straightforward. But the 17th century legal code.
The 17th century code piled on layers and layers of conditions, massive delays, public humiliations, making it nearly impossible for a woman to actually get out. So today, you have modern judges writing these agonizing 100-page judgments, twisting themselves into absolute pretzels, just trying to find some tiny loophole in a medieval text to do something that the original text permitted in one single sentence.
It's agonizing to even think about. You're trying to solve a very real, very painful modern family crisis with 17th century imperial bureaucracy.
And that creates that exact same inhibition or guilt we talked about with the farmer. The judge feels incredibly guilty for going against the established fatwa, even though his own human conscience and reason tell him this woman desperately needs justice.
So what is the fix here? If we know we can't use the 17th century law, but the community still wants to stick to the Quranic framework, how do we actually update the bylaws? Who gets it to decide?
This is where the concept of shura comes in. Mutual consultation. It's democracy, essentially.
The engine of progress, as he calls it.
The source states it very clearly. God gives the permanent values, the boundary lines. But the players on the field, the community itself, must decide the current strategy. That decision happens through shura. So the sickle was the shura decision of the past. It was the absolute best consensus of that specific era. The harvester is the shura decision of today. Both of them fully respect the permanent value of honest work and providing for the community, but the method has to change.
So Dean, in this view, is basically a parliamentary system. It legislates for the present moment, but within the overarching constitutional framework of those permanent values.
Precisely. And by freezing it, by turning past legal opinions from centuries ago into untouchable idols, we essentially broke the parliament. We fired the active legislators and we replaced them with tape recorders. And you simply cannot run a living, breathing country with a tape recorder.
To make those decisions, though, to actually have the courage to switch from the sickle to the harvester, you need something that the source points out is very often discouraged in traditional religious circles. Intellect. A tool.
Yes. We've arrived at the intellect versus miracles section of the notes. And this is highly controversial because, let's be totally honest, people love miracles. We love the magic of it. We love the spectacle.
It's entertaining. It's awe-inspiring. It feels, undeniably special when the laws of physics seem to break.
But Parwez is very aggressive here. He pushes back hard. He says Dean appeals to the intellect. It demands Dalil, rational proof, evidence. Mazhab, on the other hand, demands that you entirely suspend your disbelief. It relies on jazbat, pure emotions and sentimentality.
There is a logic puzzle he uses in the text that I just absolutely love, the 2 + 2 = 5 challenge.
It's a classic philosophical point. The source says, imagine a saint or a highly revered holy man comes up to you. He looks very pious, very traditional. And he says to you, I tell you that 2 + 2 = 5. You, being a rational person, say, no, it's 4. He says, I will prove to you that I am right. And then he physically floats up into the air. Or, as the specific example in the source describes, he takes a single strand of human hair and he milks it like a cow.
Which, frankly, if I saw a guy milk a strand of hair, I'd be terrified. But I would definitely be impressed.
Anyone would be. It would be an incredible mind-bending feat. But Parwez asks the critical grounding question. Does that miracle actually make 2 plus 2 equal 5?
No, obviously not. It just means the guy knows how to levitate or do some crazy reality-bending magic. But math is still math. 4 is still 4.
Exactly. A physical anomaly, no matter how spectacular, does not change moral or logical truth. If an entirely irrational claim is backed up by a supernatural feat, it is still an irrational claim. The source argues that miracles that paralyze the intellect are not proofs of truth. They are just distractions. A rational person must reject the claim that 2 plus 2 equals 5, no matter how high the claimant can fly.
But wait, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, but religious history is completely full of miracles. How does Parwez reconcile this stance with the history of the Prophet Muhammad? Doesn't the whole foundation of religion rely on the supernatural to some degree?
He anticipates that exact pushback, and he goes to a very specific, historically documented, and very powerful incident in the Prophet's life, the story of the eclipse.
Set the scene for us on this one because it's fascinating.
It is a day of profound personal tragedy. The Prophet's young son, Ibrahim, has just died. The Prophet is grieving. He is, at his core in this moment, just a human father who has lost a beloved child. And coincidentally, at that exact same moment, a full solar eclipse occurs. The sky goes completely dark in the middle of the day.
Now, you have to put yourself in 7th century Arabia. That is a huge, terrifying event. People were highly superstitious about celestial events.
Massive. The people look up at the sky. They're terrified. And they immediately start whispering to each other, "Look, the sun has gone dark to mourn the death of the Prophet's son. The heavens are weeping for him."
Let's just pause and look at this from a purely political or sociological perspective. That is the ultimate PR gift handed to a leader.
It is a blank check for absolute, unquestioned power. If he were a charlatan, or even just a standard opportunistic politician, he could have just stayed quiet. He didn't even have to actively lie. Just let the people believe it. Just nod and say, "Yes, the cosmos bows to my grief." He would have been instantly cemented as an untouchable supernatural being.
But he didn't do that.
No, he didn't. He actively stopped them. He gathered the people together in the very middle of his own immense grief. And he said, "The sun and the moon are 2 of God's physical signs. They follow natural laws. They do not eclipse for the birth or the death of any human being."
He directed them away from the magic and straight to physics.
He directed them to natural law, and he directed them to reason. The source highlights this as a massive defining moment in the paradigm of the deen. He categorically refused to build his authority on cheap superstition. He wanted followers who actually understood why they were following the system, not followers who were just totally dazzled by a cosmic magic show.
So if floating in the air isn't the proof, and even a solar eclipse isn't the proof, what is? What is the dalil? What is the actual evidence that a message or a system is true?
The source argues that character and conduct, sirat and kirdar, are the only eternal proofs.
Character is the miracle.
Yes. When the prophet was challenged by the skeptics of his time to, show us a sign, bring down an angel, turn this mountain into gold, his response wasn't a magic trick. It was essentially, "I have lived a whole lifetime among you before I ever brought this message. Do you not use your reason?"
Look at my track record.
Exactly. Look at my honesty. Look at my trustworthiness. Does a man who has never lied to a fellow human being for 40 years suddenly wake up and lie about God? Parwez argues that physical miracles are inherently limited. You physically had to be there to see the Red Sea part. If you weren't standing on the beach, it's just a story someone told you that you have to blindly accept. But a legacy of perfect character, a system that produces justice, that is an eternal minaret of light. Any historian, any sociologist, any seeker can examine it 1,400 years later. It stands up to empirical scrutiny.
It appeals to the mind, not just the eye. And frankly, being completely honest and just in a deeply corrupt society is significantly harder than levitating.
Precisely. It is the much harder miracle to pull off.
I want to move to the darker side of the lecture notes now. We've talked about stagnation, we've talked about this failure to use intellect, now let's talk about division. The source uses a really strong, almost shocking term to describe modern sectarianism. He calls it the Mosque of Harm, or Majidi Zarar.
This is where Parwez really pulls absolutely no punches. He references a historical incident found in the Quran, where a specific group of people in Medina built a mosque. Now, on the surface, building a mosque is universally seen as a good deed. It's pious, right?
But the Prophet was ordered to burn it to the ground.
Which sounds completely insane to a modern believer, destroy a place of worship. But the source explains the context. It wasn't actually a mosque. It was a physical headquarters for political conspiracy. It was built intentionally to create a rival faction, to divide the community. It was labeled with a religious name, but its actual function was division.
And Parwez applies this incredibly harsh label to our mosques today.
He does. He points to the literal signboards outside of places of worship that say Hanafi, Ali Hadith, Shia, Sunni. He talks about the terrible practices of barring people from other sects from entering or, physically washing the floor if a person from a different sect happens to pray there.
That deep, deep tribalism. You're not on my team, so you contaminate my space.
Parwez argues these institutions are modern Majid-e-Zarar. He says any institution that takes the one ummah, the unified community, and divides it into warring factions is fundamentally destructive, regardless of how religious or pious its outward appearance is. He even goes so far as to equate this sectarianism directly with shirk, polytheism.
Shirk, okay, that's the nuclear option in theology. Usually, that specifically means bowing down to a stone idol.
But Parwez expands the definition based on the Quranic usage. He argues that bowing to a physical stone idol is just one very primitive type of shirk, but breaking the unity of humanity, creating exclusive factions and attributing divine, unquestionable authority to your specific sect leader over the clear, unifying law of God. That is also setting up partners. You are functionally worshiping your sect, not the creator.
It brings us right back to the ritual versus spirit debate. We fight bitterly over the facing of the face, whether to face east or west, but we completely ignore the destination.
Right. The source references that famous verse. It is not righteousness that you turn your faces towards east or west. It is not about the compass direction. It is entirely about your active contribution to the welfare of humanity. But Mazhab obsesses over the physical direction. Deen cares about the social destination. The source points out the tragic irony that we spend hours arguing about exactly where to place our hands during prayer, but we don't seem to care at all that our actual neighbor is starving.
We've perfectly mastered the form, but we've completely lost the function.
Exactly. The shell is intact, but it's totally hollow inside.
This leads us to the final concept in the notes, which I think is really the psychological anchor holding all of this stagnation in place. Why do people stay in these broken systems? Why do they cling so hard to the sickle and the sect, even when it's making them miserable? The source calls it the myth of guaranteed salvation.
It's the VIP pass mentality, the idea of a birthright heaven.
I'm on the winning team, I have the right label, so I'm safe.
The source critiques the ancient Jewish and Christian claims that are mentioned in the Quran, where they said things like, the fire will not touch us except for a few days, or only we are the chosen ones and everyone else is doomed. Parwez argues that Muslims today have essentially cut and pasted this exact same arrogant mindset. They say, I was born Muslim, my name sounds Muslim, so I automatically get a free pass, regardless of what I actually do.
And he also attacks the reliance on intercession.
The idea that the prophet will somehow magically save me on the day of judgment, the source attacks this vigorously. It says this is a get-out-of-jail-free card that simply does not exist in Deen. Parwez points to the law of requital. It's the absolute law of cause and effect. You stick your hand in a fire, it burns. It absolutely does not matter if your grandfather was a great saint. The fire still burns you.
He quotes a story about the prophet speaking to his own daughter, Fatima, right?
Yes. The prophet tells her, my deeds are my own and your deeds are yours. I cannot save you from the consequences of God's law if your own deeds do not save you. If the prophet himself cannot save his own beloved daughter against the universal law of requital, how can a random person 1,400 years later expect a free ride just because they carry a specific cultural label?
It's a very results-oriented theology. It's brutal, honestly, but it's incredibly fair.
It is entirely fair. It asks one simple question. Does your system actually work? Does it produce a just, equitable, advanced society? If not, no amount of chanting or rituals will prove that you are on the right path. The proof is strictly in the pudding. The Quran says, bring your evidence, hatu burhanakum. You cannot claim to be the chosen people of God if your actual societies are the most backward, corrupt, and illiterate on the face of the earth. The physical results contradict the spiritual claim.
So bringing this all together now, it is a very heavy diagnosis. We have the trap of trivial questioning that shrinks our freedom, the failure to distinguish permanent moral values from temporary changing bylaws, the rejection of intellect in favor of cheap superstition, and the fracturing of our unity into these hostile sects.
It's a comprehensive step-by-step map of civilizational decline.
So what is the solution? What does the source actually want the listener to do with this information?
The proposed solution is a total return to Deen. But, and this is the most critical distinction, not a return to the past, a return to the principles.
Anchored in the permanent values, but aggressively moving forward in time.
Yes. You use the boundary lines of the Quran, honesty, justice, economic equity, human dignity, as your immutable, untouchable constitution. But then, you use Shura, democratic consultation, and Alpul, human intellect, to aggressively modernize your bylaws. You create a legal and social framework that utilizes the absolute best of for us now, 21st century science, technology, and reason.
Don't be afraid of the mechanical harvester. Use the harvester to feed the poor, because feeding the poor is the permanent value. The machine is just a tool.
Exactly. Realize that God gave you a brain so you could use it, not so you could shut it off out of some misguided sense of piety.
I want to end on a warning that the source gives right near the end of the lecture notes. It's about what he calls the intermediate generation.
This is such a perceptive sociological observation. Parwez notes that when a society is caught in transition, when the old rituals clearly no longer make sense, but a new, rational understanding hasn't fully taken root yet, you get a generation that is deeply confused.
And that's us, right? We are that generation.
That's the generation that uses the mechanical harvester or the internet or modern finance, but constantly feels deeply guilty about it. They have these lingering inhibitions. They are conflicted. They are trying so hard to straddle two totally different boats, the medieval mindset and the modern reality, and they are just being torn apart by the tension.
But the real warning isn't just about the discomfort of that intermediate generation. It's about the generation after that.
The kids. The youth.
What happens to them, according to the source?
The next generation won't feel the guilt. They won't have the emotional attachment to the old ways. They will just see the blatant hypocrisy. They will look at a religion that constantly fights against observable reality, a religion that insists on using a hand sickle in the age of artificial intelligence. And they won't try to patiently fix it. They won't write long essays trying to reform it.
They'll just delete it from their lives.
They will discard it entirely. They will walk away and abandon the faith completely because it simply does not solve their real-world problems. And Parwez argues 50 years ago that the absolute only way to save faith for the future is to make it rational again, to prove that it isn't an obstacle to human progress, but that it was designed to be the very engine of it.
That is a remarkably powerful and honestly slightly terrifying place to leave this discussion. It really forces you sitting there listening to ask yourself a hard question. Are we holding on to the sickle just because we think it's holy, or are we clinging to it simply because we are terrified of the new?
And to add to that, are we just passively waiting around for some magical miracle to drop from the sky and save us? Or are we actually willing to do the hard, grueling work of building a collective character that serves as its own undeniable proof?
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. It was a dense one today, definitely a lot of heavy theology and sociology mixed together, but hopefully it sparked some new lights on for you.
Indeed.
Yay.
Keep thinking, keep analyzing, and keep questioning, but constructively, of course.
We will catch you on the next one.
Goodbye.